a cultural hero or a role model or anything like that. You know, I don't want it to be the absolute last word in what the trendy style.
Not an article, not a rumor, not a censored memoir. For the first time, Linda Ronstadt has directly named the people who have hurt her most in her career. 5 names, 5 stories that she thought she would take to the grave. No one forced her. No one set her up. It's just that at some point when the voice has left the body, people start to want to speak in other ways. And she chose this way. What she's about to tell you will change the way you look at seemingly flawless relationships, collaborations, and rock history that you once believed to be glorious. Everyone knows that the Eagles were Linda Ronstadt's backup band before they became American rock icons. What's less well known is that Linda opened the door for them to the big stage. She chose them not because she lacked talent, but because she believed they had substance. Glenn Frey, still finding his way, was someone Linda appreciated, both his musicianship and his teamwork. But once the reputations began to shift, so did the distance. When the Eagles hit it big with Hotel California and the hits that followed, no one talked about the time they were behind Ronstadt. Nor did Glenn Frey. In a 1977 interview, when asked about the band's role as backup for solo artists, Frey simply said, "We learned a lot from those days, but frankly we're on our own now." Linda didn't respond. But after that day, all invitations to perform together with the Eagles stopped. Things came to a head at the Hollywood Bowl. It was supposed to be a memorable reunion. Linda would join the Eagles for a few songs, just like they had on their first tour. But just before the set list was finalized, Glenn Frey's manager called to suggest a change of pace. The Eagles would perform after Linda. They wanted to close the show. Linda refused. She didn't need a place on stage, but she also couldn't stand to have her role rewritten in the story, especially not when it was someone who had once walked off her stage. In response, Frey cancelled the collaboration. His final message was, "I don't think the audience will be expecting you anymore." It's not that Linda doesn't understand competition, but with Glenn she sees something else, hand-washing. She doesn't need credit, but she recognizes it when people deliberately erase her from the collective memory. Years later, in a private conversation with a journalist, Linda was asked why she had never appeared at Eagle celebrations. But having laid the foundation, she simply laughed. Some people are comfortable living with the story they have written. I am not. For Linda, it wasn't Glenn Frey she hated. It was what he represented, a way of getting ahead by rejecting the first steps. She didn't expect thanks, but she didn't forget to ignore them either. Frey died in 2016. Linda did not speak publicly, nor did she appear at any memorial events. Behind the scenes, she only told an old friend, "I wish him peace. But if there is one thing I regret, it is that I thought we were allied." Linda doesn't need to win in other people's memories. But when she looks back, Frey is still the first one to appear. Not because of fame, but because of the feeling of being left out of a story that should have had a right to exist. The man who saved the world but left me alone. Neil Young was one of the artists Linda had truly admired. He was outspoken, anti-war, and a defender of the underdog, values Linda shared. But that similarity led to one of the biggest rifts she had ever experienced in the music industry. In 1976, Linda and Neil were invited to a benefit concert for immigrant workers in California. The event was organized in a spirit of solidarity. But even at the first meeting, Linda sensed something was wrong. She suggested songs like Desperado and Blue Bayou, light, but with emotional depth. Neil shook his head. "We're not here to sing salon music," he said almost mockingly. Linda held back. The second time, he interrupted her as she discussed the set list. He insisted that Raol protest songs don't need to be emotionally easy to listen to. To her, It wasn't just a rejection. It was his way of denying her part in the struggle. On stage that day, Linda stood on the sidelines, not included in the general acts as planned. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but when she got off the stage, she cried in the dressing room. Not because she was being left out, but because she felt excluded from something she should have had a right to be a part of. She said nothing to Neil. No retort or question. But after that night, she turned down every invitation to collaborate with him. Once, the organizer suggested she sing a duet with Neil on a live TV show. Linda simply replied, "I choose not to stand next to someone who despises me." Neil was not silent. In a 1978 interview, when asked about female artists in the struggle, he replied, "Some have good voices but not the guts to touch what really hurts." Linda knew he was talking about her, and she never forgot. Linda did not speak publicly. No interviews, no criticism. But at an informal gathering with some old friends in the industry, when the conversation happened to mention Neil Young, someone asked her what she thought of him after all these years. Linda did not have to think long. She said only one sentence, slowly and clearly. "He is very good at making people believe that he is on the right side even when he is the one who silences them." In the years that followed, Linda avoided any projects involving Neil. Even when he sent a brief apology through a mutual friend, she didn't respond. Not because she hated him, but because she didn't believe in apologies until the end. To Linda, Neil represented a kind of male artist who assumed his cause was superior to anyone else's. They believed women should stay with their love songs and stay on the sidelines of protests, unless invited to speak. Linda didn't need their permission. But when the person she once trusted pushed her aside, it didn't feel like disappointment. It felt like suffocation. Years later, Linda was asked if she would have reacted differently if she could go back to that day. She replied, "I wouldn't have had to speak up to defend myself. Time would have done it for me." For Linda, the most painful thing wasn't being rejected. It was having someone who stood up for justice disregard her ability to walk the walk because she chose a different path, one that was just less noisy. Neil Young kept performing, kept fighting, kept being honored. Linda stayed silent. But in that silence was a scar, and if she had to pick one person who made her lose faith in her allies, it was Neil. The never-ending joke. Linda Ronstadt is not the type to succumb to fame. Even though working with many great artists, she has never allowed herself to be reduced to a side note in any project. With MC Jagger, it started as an opportunity and ended as a prime example of the so-called attraction of status, something Linda never believed was worth sacrificing her dignity for. In the 1980s, Linda agreed to participate in a celebrity-studded charity event. Mick proposed the idea for the finale. All the artists would come on stage to sing a new version of Sympathy for the Devil. Linda didn't object. But after the first rehearsal, Jagger's publicist released promotional images for the event, with Linda's photo next to him captioned, "Jagger and guest vocalists." No names, no permission, and no one asked. Linda kept quiet, but after the incident, she actively refused any collaborations with the Rolling Stones or Jagger for more than a decade. She told a close friend that she felt dragged into a sideshow to feed someone else's ego. That was until 1987, when MC Jagger appeared on a late-night talk show. The host made a familiar joke. "Linda Ronstadt is one of the most outstanding voices you've ever sung with." "How's that?" Mick smirked and replied, "She looks better when she's not singing." The audience laughed. The host laughed. The studio erupted in reflexive laughter. Only one person didn't laugh, the woman who had stood next to him on stage, who had believed herself to be a colleague and not a prop in someone else's performance. She did not respond to the press, but wrote clearly in her diary, "They say women should laugh when men joke. But if it is funny, I choose to remain silent as an act of protest." Linda wasn't surprised that Jagger said that. What saddened her was the ease with which such jokes were accepted, especially coming from a male rock icon. And more than anything, the implicit understanding that women who didn't fight back were more likely to stay in the game. She was asked to sing on a Jagger record in the early 90s on the condition that she change her image, be more sexy. Linda refused flat out and without negotiation. She made it clear to her manager, "I don't have to be sexy to be asked to sing. And if that's the criteria, I don't even want to sing." It's not that Linda didn't appreciate Mick's talent. She once said he was such a good stage performer that he convinced the crowd that every line was theirs. But to her, Mick was always the embodiment of unapologetic power, power that exploited the image of others to bolster its own. Linda didn't expect an apology from Jagger, nor did she expect an explanation. Such people, she thought, rarely felt the need to say anything after being coddled. But if anyone had ever asked who had made her lose all faith in her ability to work with people at the pinnacle of fame, Linda would have said without hesitation, Mick Jagger. For her, it wasn't a grudge. It was a line. And once someone crossed that line, no matter how famous, they were no longer in her world. The woman who makes me feel unworthy. After her encounters with male artists, where ego, power, and prejudice were always present, Linda once believed that women would be the place where she would find empathy, understanding, and fairness. She thought that people on the margins of power would know how to hold each other together. But then there were situations that made her realize that not all wounds come from brutality or contempt. There are wounds that come from people you once admired, once trusted. And because of that, it leaves a deeper cut. For Linda, that happened with Joni Mitchell. Linda has never made it a secret that she looks up to Joni as a role model, not just because of her voice, but because Joni writes her own songs, owns her own sound, and has complete creative control over what she performs. Linda doesn't write her own songs. She chooses to interpret other people's songs in her own way, and that used to make her feel inferior next to people like Joni. In 1979, at a Rolling Stone concert, Linda performed a special arrangement of Joni's hit River. The response from the audience was overwhelmingly positive. Immediately after the performance, Linda walked backstage and saw Joni talking to a group of people. As Linda approached, Joni turned, smiled slightly, and said, "I didn't know my songs were so popular." The remark seemed light, but Linda could hear the sarcasm in every word. She didn't reply. She just turned away and sat quietly in the dressing room for the rest of the event. A week later, in a small interview with a music magazine, Joni was asked about artists who covered her music. She replied, "I write from my blood. No one can convey that unless they have lived it." Linda read the article, folded the magazine, and never mentioned Joni again to the press. Later, when producers suggested Mitchell's songs for her ballad album, Linda declined, not because she didn't like them, but because she didn't want to be associated with someone who had made her feel like she wasn't real enough to express other people's sadness. In the years that followed, whenever Joni Mitchell was mentioned, Linda never shied away, but she never strayed beyond neutrality. No criticism or flattery, just a quiet, clear attitude. Once, when asked if she would work with Joni again, Linda replied simply, "I admire talent, but I work with people who have both talent and kindness. For me, one is not enough." An enemy, but someone who made her doubt her own worth, something no one else had ever done, not even the men who had openly despised her. That didn't make Linda lose herself. On the contrary, she came to understand her place in the industry, an artist who chose to sing songs that felt real to her, even if she didn't write them, and that didn't make her any less sincere. During a late recording session, when only a few people remained in the mixing room, Linda shared with a close friend, "I used to think I wasn't deep enough, that I was just the person behind someone else's songs. But then I listened to my own recordings, and I realized sometimes it's the way you tell the story that makes the song mean something completely different." not a copy, a soulful version of yourself. Linda never needed anyone to validate her worth. But with Joni Mitchell, things were different. Not because Joni was better, but because Linda believed they were on the same page. It was the indifference from her once icon that took her years to shake off, the feeling that she was always one step below, even though no one had ever said it out loud. When friendship breaks down in song, Linda Ronstadt didn't have many close friends in the music industry, but her relationship with Dolly Parton was one of the few strong bonds between three of the most prominent women of the era: Linda, Dolly, and Emmylou Harris. They weren't just musical partners. They were also sisters, especially when they collaborated on the albums Trio and Trio 2. Trio's success in 1987 was unquestionable, but behind the scenes, things weren't always smooth sailing. During the making of Trio 2, released more than a decade later, Dolly asked to have her vocals removed from some of the recordings for personal reasons and scheduling reasons. Linda and the producers agreed and decided to keep Emmylou and Linda's vocals on just a few tracks. Linda thought it was a done deal. But when the album was released, Dolly was surprised and unhappy with the way it was handled. There was no clear dialogue between them after that. No public argument, no back and forth in the press, just silence that lasted for years. Linda feels misunderstood in a place where she once thought there was trust. For Dolly, it may not be a misunderstanding but a feeling of being left out of a project she had put her heart and soul into. A friendship that once seemed unshakable begins to show cracks over seemingly small things, but neither of them is proactive enough to pull the other back. Linda didn't blame Dolly for wanting to pull out of some songs. She understood the pressure of the schedule and the artistic control that an artist like Dolly always maintained. But what hurt Linda more was that neither of them had taken the initiative to sit down and talk things out, to clear up the misunderstandings. They had once had enough trust to create together, to step on stage without rehearsing, to sing in harmony without saying much. But after that, everything was as if the power had been pulled. No scandals, no publicity, no criticism. It was just that from then on, they had not performed together on the same stage again for many years. In a private conversation with Emmylou Harris in 2005, Linda said something that left listeners speechless. "I'm not angry at Dolly for choosing to withdraw. I'm upset that she didn't ask me before believing that I was deliberately pushing her out. It was not a reproach, but a regret. Because if they had just talked frankly once, all the misunderstandings might have disappeared. But the distance created by silence is often harder to fill than any argument." Years later, when Linda, Dolly, and Emmylou were honored together at an award ceremony in Washington, they had a chance to meet again. They hugged, smiled at the camera, and exchanged polite words like old friends. Everything was proper. But Linda could clearly sense that something between them was gone forever. There was no conflict, no resentment. It was just that something that had once been beautiful had faded away, and no one knew how to bring it back. To her, Dolly was not a bad person. She even described Dolly as intelligent and sharp, a natural producer in the shape of a folk artist. But she did not deny that a distance had formed, and that it stemmed from both of them choosing silence over dialogue when misunderstandings arose. Linda doesn't need every relationship to end well. But if there's one person she regrets losing the most, it's Dolly Parton. She once wrote in a private note, "There are people who are not worth keeping, but there are also people who are worth keeping. It's just a pity that we don't have time to keep them properly." Not all wounds come from outright betrayals. There are small, slow, but never healing cuts because they come from trust that was once real. Linda Ronstadt doesn't tell these stories to hurt anyone. She doesn't expect an apology, nor does she need anyone to defend her. But in a world where female artists are often asked to keep quiet to maintain their image, speaking up, but late, is always valuable. If what you just heard makes you think about the dark side of the spotlight, or simply makes you want to hear Linda's voice from a different perspective, leave a comment. We want to know what you think. And if you think this story deserves to be known by more people, don't hesitate to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other hidden corners of